Can we sort of talk about how you got to where you are, sort of your professional or educational background?
Are we going in order?
Sure.
Oh, no.
Let's start in order, and then we'll mix it up later.
So I am 26 years old, and I started podcasting 4 years ago now, right when Serial was blowing up. So the timing turned out to be kind of perfect. I initially planned to go into public radio instead of podcasting because that's the only form of radio documentaries I knew that existed in the world, and podcasting was just like not a mainstream medium at the time. So my parents like really freaked out when senior year of college. I was like, I'm not gonna be a lawyer. I'm gonna make radio documentaries. And they're like, how are you gonna make money doing that? So the way I did it is initially I worked for my college radio station, made a show called Dates and Other Mistakes. I feel really bad for James. He's heard this like 8,000 times. I work with him. And then Dates and Other Mistakes was terrible, but I fell in love with radio and realized that I liked doing it in like the practical application of the actual profession rather than just like in my brain. And then I interned at a bunch of journalism outlets and applied to journalism school for my master's in journalism. And that was mostly to satisfy my brown parents and show them that I was going to get an advanced degree. So I ended up going to Northwestern and fighting the faculty to let me focus on audio because they, at that time, it was 2015, they did not believe audio was a viable medium, and they kept telling me to do TV instead, and I was like, no, I'm not gonna do that. Like, have you paid attention to Serial? It was on SNL. And from there, I heard about the Transom Radio Workshop. I did the week-long workshop, which you guys should all apply to if you're interested in podcasting. Just Google transom.org. And the week-long workshops are somewhat affordable. I crowdfunded my way there. And then after that, I just like got an internship at WNYC, hated it, didn't do any work of value, got hired at SiriusXM, was told I was gonna be producing original shows, but instead was relegated to cutting tape from other people's podcasts. And so I got really sick of it, and I was like, okay, I've spent all these years, all I wanna do is make a show, and I'm not getting to make a show. So I started making a show about my own life because that way I was forced to meet deadlines because I was only accountable to myself. And the only guests I had to book were like my parents and my boyfriend. And yeah, I just started recording things, learning how to edit as I was making it. I learned how to run the business part of it. And then one thing led to another, and I got hired at KPCC.
Yeah, so I have like a messy journey that I'm trying to just shorten because it's so long. But I started at Cal State Long Beach. I was an anthropology major because I wanted to graduate really quickly in a major that's easy. I feel bad for anyone bashing anthropology, but that was my thought process. And I initially was gonna major in music, and I was like, this is just too much work, and I don't want to be a classical musician. And I also, I don't know, I in anthropology, I was like, you know, I really love making documentaries, but there's not a program here that did it at the time. This was 2010-11. So I started taking documentary courses in the film department. And then eventually I thought I was gonna be a documentary filmmaker, and I interned at all these other companies making docs, and I really hated it. I hated the people there, I just hated the work. It was just not fun. But I was working really closely with an editor at the last internship I did in documentaries, which was Current TV. It was like an Al Gore company. And she was like, you know what, you should try public radio because you like music, you like audio, like give that a shot. And it's still documentary storytelling. So that's when she forwarded me like a job at KPCC as an intern on this now dead show called Off Ramp. And that was amazing because that show just forced you to do everything. The first day you start, they hand you a microphone and like, okay, now go record something and make a story out of it. And that kind of like, you know, just pushing yourself in the water and just jumping in really helped in terms of just getting my interest aligned with like, okay, yeah, I want to do this. And so the problem is like I was pretty successful in the internship and I got all these accolades, and then I couldn't find a job. So I then was like, all right, I'm gonna leave public radio because the only things I can find are jobs that are free. and I worked in reality TV, and that was a disaster. That was in writing, and then honestly, that experience was when I realized, like, oh, I really love public radio because I hate everything else. So I told myself, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna give myself one more shot. I did this dinky internship in a small town in Marfa, 2,000 people, and I told myself, I'm gonna make a podcast. And if I don't make a podcast in this 6-month time, then it's not meant to be. If I make the podcast and I don't get any attention from it, then it's not meant to be. I'm just gonna call it quits. And I was like inspired by, I think it was, oh my God, I think it was like Lady Gaga who did this. She gave herself like a year to do something, and then she's like, if I don't make it in a year, I'm gonna like not. So I did that route. And that's when I made the show There's Something Out There. Like everyone in Marfa believed in like scary stories, and they all thought that ghosts were real and aliens existed. It's a small town. So I was like, well, there's no one to interview but these people, and if they all have these stories, then I'm gonna do it. And with sci-fi and horror stories, this is all true stories, you can really play with like sound design and music. Like that's the scariest type of storytelling, is when you can't see anything. You have to envision it. So I really played around with that, and I had a lot of fun, and then luckily I got a lot of attention from that show, and eventually landed working with Misha at KPCC.
And now we're best friends.
Yeah,
Just kidding.
exactly. Just kidding, you said?
Awkward. How's everyone doing? Thank you for everyone for coming out here on a school day. Luckily, this is the day I'm not teaching here, so though that means I had to come to campus when I didn't need to, so I guess I have mixed feelings about that. In any case, my background in podcasting is completely actually detached from my background in academia, though this year those two forces are actually going to come and meet one another. But where I started was when I was a sophomore in college. This was up at UC Berkeley in the early 90s. I started interning at the local college radio station up there, KALX, and that turned into 13 years of doing college radio. And so a lot of my background in terms of making audio really links back to that time. And then around 2002 or so, because I was already working as a music writer in print, I contacted NPR and basically cold pitched myself to, at the time it was Morning Edition, to do music reviews for them, because I was already doing that in print for a variety of publications. And that began my relationship with NPR, first one Morning Edition, and then later, these days, I do it for All Things Considered. But my interest in podcasting really began around probably 2010, 2012, somewhere in the middle of there, where I was interviewed by Jesse Thorne, and Jesse Thorne runs the Maximum Fun Network, which is a podcasting network based here in Southern California. They have probably at this point somewhere in the ballpark of 3 to 4 dozen shows under their distribution umbrella. But Jesse is also the host on a show that originally began, its roots are also in college radio at UC Santa Cruz's station. It was a show at the time called The Sound of Young America. It's now called Bullseye. It's aired on a variety of NPR stations where Jesse interviews different people. It's very kind of fresh air-ish. And Jesse invited me to come on to his show to talk about music, and this is when he had relatively first landed in Los Angeles from the Bay. And he produced his podcast and his show out of his living room. Like literally, we were sitting in his living room. He had a desk set up, he had microphones, a mixer, a computer. And previous to this, I had listened to some podcasts even as early as then, but I just assumed that those podcasts were produced in professional radio studios. And I realized when Jesse was interviewing me, oh, you can just literally do this in a living room. And because I had a very long history with radio, but had stopped doing college radio around '04, I was itching to do something similar to that. And largely inspired by Jesse's example, in 2012, I had a sabbatical here at Long Beach, and so I had a semester off to myself, and I went out and bought some decent microphones and some basic equipment, and then started producing my own podcast, the one that you mentioned earlier, Jess, called the Sidebar, where I would interview people in the music world about music. And so in 2014, Jesse invited me to join it was a pop culture panel show called Pop Rocket. It's actually very similar to the pop culture happy hour that NPR does. I was on that show for 2 years. And around the time of the 2016 election, I really got the itch to want to branch off and do something on my own. So along with my co-host, Morgan Rhodes, who's a music supervisor, she worked a lot with Ava DuVernay. She was the music supervisor on Selma. She did the first season of Queen Sugar. She currently does the music for Dear White People on Netflix. And Morgan and I had been paired up at KPCC a few years before that. And so the concept behind Heat Rocks, which has been around since the fall of 2017, I think we're up to 80 episodes right now, is we invite a guest on every week to talk about one of their favorite albums. And so the episode that will air next week is with future soul artist Cy Smith talking about Michelle Ndegeocello's Plantation Lullabies from 1993. We had Macy Gray on to talk about Kanye West, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the idea behind the show. And then starting later this year, I was approached by the Chancellor's Office of the Cal State system to be the host for I think it's either a 20 or 40 episode podcast focused on higher education innovation that's going to be called Higher Ed Rewired. Higher ed policy is not something I'm actually that interested in, but because I do have obviously links with the Cal State system and I have a lot of experience with hosting, they asked if I would be interested in doing this, and since I don't actually have to produce it, I just have to show up and talk to people, which is fine, I love doing that, I said sure, and so that'll debut sometime later this year. And that's the first time my academic career and my career in audio are actually aligning with each other.
I'm curious, based on all your experience, I feel like what kind of gets lost in, especially us very young people, is that podcasting is part of this wider radio ecosystem. So if you could talk about the difference between like public radio and commercial radio and college radio and podcasting, and there's one other I was thinking of. Or I think very specifically public radio and podcasting is I think something that has a lot of.
I think, okay, so here's one way to understand it. There are for-profit companies out there that make podcasts, and that got into the podcasting game somewhere around 2014 specifically. The first one after This American Life, which was born out of public radio, was Gimlet. And then there's Crooked Media, Luminary is about to launch soon. Spotify bought Gimlet, so Spotify is technically a for-profit player in the podcasting game. What am I missing? There's local ones here like Wondery.
And Max Fun was actually I would say the first podcast company, with Jesse Thorne. He's like a pioneer. But yeah, and with LA, there's Wondery, there's Western Sound, Neon Hum, all those launched within the last couple years.
Is Earwolf still around?
Mm-hmm. Earwolf is, they're with Midroll and Stitcher. Those are all like a big conglomerate. That's also in LA too, but they have offices in New York. So there's a lot of stuff in LA.
Yeah.
But
So I think those are all the for-profit companies. And then public radio is existing with the premise that we are creating public service content. So that includes KCRW, KPCC locally, and then when you start like scaling out, there's WBEZ in Chicago, there's WNYC in New York, there's WHYY, which is where Fresh Air comes from. So those are like the specific member stations that are doing podcasts, but they still have that public service mission. And then you have NPR headquarters, which is like NPR branded podcast shows like How I Built This. What are some others?
Hidden Brain, technically Wait, Don't Tell Me. What else? There's a bunch of them.
Invisibilia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Code Switch, I think.
Yeah.
Code Switch.
Yeah. So all of those, it's very confusing, but that's all in the public radio ecosystem.
Yeah, the lines are getting blurred now. Podcasting with like what KPCC is doing, getting into the podcasting game. We're looking directly at places that are for profit, like Gimlet, like Radiotopia, like Wondery, and we're trying to compete with them. And same with Max Fun as well. Like those are companies that we're seeing their content, and we're now in the same space. So the lines have been less. They're not as hard drawn, but I guess the main difference is that public radio is about telling stories about the community and serving the community, and for-profit podcasting companies are all about making money.
I would also add, for those of you who are relatively new to it, it's important to realize there are entities that produce podcasts, which is to say that they put shows together, they do the engineering, they basically do all of the work to create the episode itself. And then there are companies who distribute the podcast. So they'll take something that maybe someone else has produced, but they provide a platform for marketing and being able to get it out into the world. And of course, a lot of companies do both. But so at Maximum Fun, which is where my show is, they both produce and distribute my show, but they also distribute a lot of other shows that are produced by others. And so there is these differences between, again, who makes the content versus who distributes it. And again, sometimes it's the same thing, but sometimes it's separate.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, sort of based on who you were in 2014, how that boom affected your, like, career path. Because I feel like it made podcasting much more viable than it was, like, in 2012.
I'll start with that. So in 2014 is when I was doing my internship, and I could not find a job, and like it was really tough, and I was looking at public radio stations. I even looked at a place in Iowa to be a reporter. I didn't want to go to Iowa, but I just needed a job. And nobody was hiring. And so when I set out to make a podcast, this was right around the time of Serial, a little before it happening. But my first job was actually in podcasting. So I was working on a show at Radiotopia, and essentially it was that year 2014 where all of a sudden there became a lot more job opportunities, and people were really looking for producers. And I'm distinguishing producers because, when you go into podcasting, a lot of it is like there are a host, there's an editor, there's a senior producer, there's a producer. Sometimes you're all of that. But because of Serial, those jobs weren't just one person anymore. Companies had enough of a budget to make all these different types of positions, so you're not drowning in work. And one of the jobs that is most desired, I feel like, maybe for me, but also that they're hiring a lot of, were producers. People who are basically the brains behind the entire operation. You're managing everyone's schedule, you're researching everything, you're cutting tape, you're putting the entire show together, you're doing everything but hosting. So yeah, for me at least, right around 2014 is actually when the door opened again for me in terms of getting a job into podcasting and public radio.
I'm curious if you could expand more about the members of a team now in public radio podcasts and what they do.
Sure.
Especially the teams that you work with.
Yeah. So let's see. At KPCC, there's only 3 of us, 4 if we include Mary. That's not how it should be, but there's our senior producer / head of podcasting, Arwen Nix, and Misha and I are both producers, and we have a fill-in producer. And our roles vary on so many other things. What we're essentially doing is our first phase of development is we're working with a lot of reporters. They come with us with ideas, and we're like, okay, we're going to turn this around and make this into a really big podcast with like 7 to 10 episodes. So, with us, what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be the lead producer on it, which is pretty much everything that I said. It's like you're managing the entire project, but you also need the editing skills. You need to know how to write. You need to know how to score. You need to know how to sound design. You're going to be doing all of that. Whereas the host and the reporter, the way it works at KPCC is they do a lot of the reporting sometimes. And then they write the first draft of the script. They go out and do the interviews. They're the ones who are reading the scripts and voicing it. And then we have an engineer. After we record everything, I'm going to back up. We hire a composer. So after it goes through that, we hire a composer. We have a digital team. So in terms of social media, in terms of artwork, in terms of website, we have an entire digital team that will help us with that. We somewhat have a sales team, although they're not up to speed yet, in terms of now you need to sell ads. So they're going to be the ones reaching out to companies and selling all the ads. But as producers, we're the ones who are essentially creating all the decks, creating all the information, making sure the deadlines are met. You're talking to all these various departments. You're overseeing pretty much the entire project. And then the last phase is engineering. So we have an engineer to mix everything, to master everything. So it's a pretty big team, I would say. Like, even though it's a 3 or 4 person team for full-time in podcasting, we're reaching out to maybe 20 or 30 people to work under us when we ever do a project.
What do those teams look like with your independent projects?
They look like ourselves. They're just us. I think I can give the example of Beginner, and then if you guys want to talk about independent projects you've worked on. With Beginner, I hosted, I wrote, I edited the tape in Audition at the time, and I then begged my friends to read my script and listen to my episode, and then did not know what to do even to engineer it. So I don't think any of those episodes are mastered now that I think about it, but did not hire a composer, forced my boyfriend to play some piano that I would then put into the background, in addition to using like free sound libraries like freesound.org or Free Music Archive or whatever, and then crediting those people accordingly. But I definitely used a lot of Poddington Bear. I don't know if you guys are familiar. Yeah, I think it was mostly just like convincing friends to help and like read script. I did hire this woman named Devin Taylor, who's an editor at Gimlet. I paid her $200 for 2 hours of her time to edit my first 2 episode scripts. And that was a really good use of money, and I'm really glad I did that.
I mean, our show's weekly. We have a 3-person team that primarily works on it. Myself and my co-host Morgan, we're responsible for doing background research on both the artist, or I should say on the guest who's coming in, as well as the album that they've chosen. So we develop that script. We obviously host the show, and then we provide notes on the first draft of the episode. And then Christian is our basically everything else. So he engineers the tapings, he does the edits on the show itself, he also does our booking for us. And then all 3 of us basically share producer credits. And I think as you've heard from the other 2 folks here, being a producer, it's really ill-defined because it more or less just means like everything that you don't farm out to somebody else. And I think the thing that I didn't really think enough about going into it is just how much work is involved and how much it really needs stability and competence from everyone involved. And part of it's because we went through, I think, 4 producers in our first year, and it was largely through a combination of different forces, but not having that stability meant that we were always kind of playing catch up with ourselves. Luckily, Christian's been with us now for about the last, not quite year, but at least about 9 months. And having that stability, I think, has allowed me and Morgan just to kind of focus on making sure that we can do our work as best as we can as the hosts for it, because we know he's taking care of everything else, and that's a really important work balance.
Yeah, for me with my independent stuff, to clarify, it's I always try to do narrative storytelling podcasts. I don't do the 2-person talking podcast just because like my background is in sound design and music, so I'm going to use that to my strength. So with that, at least the last project I did with the competition, I love to collaborate with people. I just go crazy when it's just myself. So it was me and 2 other friends who are also in public radio. One of them works at a company called APM and another one at a new company called Western Sound. And so we just got together and we just said the roles were like, okay, this is my idea, so I'm gonna take the reins on hosting it. You're gonna be the editor, and then you're gonna be like a senior producer / if you wanna host with me, then do it too. So, and I didn't talk about editors, but I think everyone kind of mentioned it. It's just super important that one of the last steps before you release something, you want someone to look at it, someone that you trust to make sure that everything is correct, that you're not sounding like an idiot, that it sounds really good. So that was really crucial for us to have. And luckily with our entire team, all of us, we have a music background. We all know how to edit. We all were producers for a very long time, so we all know how to do everything. So it was essentially very easy for us to just collaborate. But I was very careful with choosing people that I trusted and that I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew who to work with in order for me to kind of make the best product.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about actual technical knowledge. So Misha actually wrote like a how to make a podcast guide that kind of covers a lot. So I don't know the exact link, but you should look that up later.
It's just howtomakeapodcast.org.
Write it down, it's really amazing.
But is there sort of a thing that people should know about like basic technical skills and what the professional level looks like beyond what you can do like on an amateur level?
I mean, I'm still learning from James, so I defer to him.
Okay. Oliver, you want to go first?
Well, yeah, I mean, mine will probably be a little bit simpler, which is, I think the most important thing, first and foremost, is like, give a shit about the quality of your audio. I'm someone who makes, one of those two people in a room talking podcasts. And what annoys me when I hear others who do something very similar is they clearly, I don't know what they're taping through, but it sounds like it's recorded on like sub-Skype audio quality. I've heard very popular podcasts where a co-host happens to be maybe out of town for a particular day, and they have them phone in. And so you're listening to one person who's in a studio and then one person who's on a phone line. And it always just flabbergasts me because if you invest this much in your product, you're going to be out of town, bring a portable mic with you. I mean, at the very least, you can use the microphone on a smartphone, send that audio in, they can tape sync it. It's really simple to do. So it just kind of astounds me when podcasts turn out subpar audio, because it's never been easier in the history of making audio to make really decent sounding audio and do it inexpensively. So from a very basic technical point of view, just start with that. Like, get decent mics, learn how to use basic recording software, and take it from there.
Yeah, 100% agree on that. And I mean, I think the biggest for me, what helped me, because I didn't make audio documentaries before going into this field, is whatever show that you want to make, listen to a shit ton of those kinds of types of shows and nitpick everything. I remember when I started, I was listening to This American Life. I remember it was like the last year at Cal State Long Beach. I was here. I had no idea what This American Life was until I discovered it, and I was like, holy fuck, this is amazing. But I went to the minute details of when does the music start? When does the music fade? Where are the breaths at? Where are the pauses at? What's the structure of the story? What's the beat? What's the rhythm of the story that they're doing? The interview techniques. What kind of questions are they asking? And what are they cutting out and what are they leaving in? Like, I went really, really minute. But that's because I knew that I wanted to do sound-rich, crazy audio documentary features. If you want a different type, whether it's fiction or two-way or whatever else is out there, just listen to a ton of that and analyze it. And whatever shows that you love, figure out why you like it and imitate it. Like, that's the key thing, is just to imitate it. And pretty soon, it's like once you're listening to all these different types of shows and you're imitating all these different shows, that's when you're gonna find your own style. Like, that's when, because people say like, oh, you don't want to copycat, but that's like important for you to learn. You just gotta learn from the people who are doing it well and then choose what you like from it and create your own style from it.
Okay, I know I said James should talk here, but how are you guys editing in audio? Any of you? Are you currently editing anything? What software do you use? Audacity, Audition. Okay, cool. So here's the thing. When you're editing audio, you want to be as organized as humanly possible. So you want to listen through to your interview and document the parts that are most important. I like using Google Drive, but you could just like create Word docs or write it on a piece of paper. And then you want to kind of separate out the clips that you like, whether you're doing it for an interview podcast or for a narrative show. Organization is always going to help you. And then the other thing is, like, in the tracks themselves, you want to label every single track and keep one type of audio on one type of track. And that will allow you to experiment more, because the more organized you are, the more things you can bring in, because it's easy to eliminate them again too, right? And the more disorganized you are, the more confusing you're gonna create a mess for yourself and then not be able to actually get to the next level. Use color coding to your advantage and use things like markers to your advantage. So like, mark up your sessions as much as possible. Mark up your paper scripts as much as possible. And just know where all of your tape is.
I would just add, this makes me think of when I've produced a few news stories for NPR, and one of the things I did was I would interview someone, transcribe the interview. Well, technically I had someone else transcribe it because I hate transcribing myself. But I had them do it with time code so that I could always know where in the original audio I could find certain sound bites. and then would start to basically, in the way that you're describing it, label those that I would know later that I would want to clip those out in order to build the final story. And very recently, I was turned on to a surprisingly good online transcription service called Temi. That's TEMI.com, which I would say is about 90% accurate for an algorithmic transcriber. And it costs 10 cents a minute, which is really, really inexpensive. So an hour-long interview is $6, as opposed to when I used to pay a human being to do it, it would be $60 to do that. And if you're working with a lot of interviews for your potential show, it's one way to be able to get that transcription, have the time codes, and as a way of helping to organize your content.
Also, Otter.ai from Google is another transcription service that's actually free.
Spell that?
Otter, OTTER.ai. And once you run out of your allotted minutes, you can just make a new account under a different name.
That's I shouldn't be saying it, but KPCC does
That.
utilize that system.
Wow.
Well, because I'll say this too, just highlighting both of these comments about transcription. The new show that KPCC is working on, we interviewed more than 100 people. Some of those interviews were more than 4 hours long. We fed everything through transcription, and we did what we do true transcription, where it's word for word. I timestamp every time someone talks, and we do that because we're now in the stage of, okay, now we have to take this audio. We have maybe about 300 hours of audio, and we have to condense it into a 7 to 8 part series that the episodes may be 20 minutes or 40 minutes long each. And there's absolutely no way that you can go back and listen to all that audio. You're gonna have to transcribe, and it makes the process so much easier in the end.
Also, in terms of technical knowledge, practice makes perfect. So just like go record random stuff and then go into whatever editing software you have and make stuff and put music to it. You know, you can rip music that you're not allowed to use for things that you're just making for yourself.
So James kind of touched on this, but beyond technical knowledge, for people who want to start their own podcast, what are things that they should be thinking of in terms of concepts and like, why should we care kind of stuff?
Okay. Well, ask yourself, should this be a podcast before you do anything else? Some things are better as an Instagram story, and that's it. Some things are better as a text story, and that's the way that they should live. Some things should be a video series. Maybe write a book if that's what fits the story that you're trying to tell the best. So ask yourself, should this be a podcast? And then ask yourself why this is audio native. So, for example, for the big one, we started working on the show about the big earthquake, and one of the very first things that happened was we were interviewing this seismologist, Lucy Jones, and we were in her office, and I asked her, I was like, can you make a noise to show me the difference between different types of earthquakes or different magnitudes of earthquakes? And she's like, and I was like, well, can you like drum on the table or rip up some paper, just like make any kind of noise? And she's like, actually, earthquakes are most similar to sound waves. The same waves that are sound waves are like closest to the waves that an earthquake makes. So earthquakes are essentially sound waves traveling through the ground. And she's like, the best way to illustrate this is through a stringed instrument, which I happen to play, called the viola da gamba. Not just a normal viola, not a violin, not a cello. And so we had her come in studio and play this for us. And it informed the entire sonic tone of the series. We decided to do initially a strings-only soundtrack that was then changed a little bit to mostly strings. And I think if you ask yourself that question, you might find things that are very surprising. In some cases, you might find out that you shouldn't make a podcast at all because your content is not audio native or does not have any element that is specific to audio. But in other moments, you might find out something that really elevates the story that you're trying to tell.
I feel like I need to move this forward because y'all have to keep like craning back
Oh yeah, that's fine.
between questions.
Yeah, you can go ahead, actually.
Sure. I mean, the one thing that I think we learned the hard way with Heat Rocks is that ultimately I think a good niche idea for a show is better than a great generalist idea. And the reason being is that podcast audiences tend to flock to things that they're interested in an intense way, as opposed to stuff that they're kind of just interested in. So with us, we our show is not rooted in any genre. We might talk about a rap album one week, it might be a jazz album the next, it might be a pop album the next. And I think if we had just done a show that was just about, let's say, 90s hip hop, we probably would have developed a bigger audience faster by being that niche, because that would have tapped into a pre-existing community of folks interested in that, as opposed to someone who might like, let's say, a week in which we talk about, let's say, a Kendrick Lamar album, but then are they going to come back to listen to something about a Janet Jackson album? Maybe not. And so it's harder to keep an audience week to week. The audience that we have that's loyal, it took us a really long time to get there. And basically, they trust us. They're just going to kind of go with whatever the episode is. It's less important to them that they actually like the art, like the guest, or like the album. But I think if we could have rebooted this, I think we would have had a more serious discussion about maybe starting off very niche, and then we can always expand from there. But when you start general, you can't then reverse course and then go niche. And so I think if you have an idea, think about what is the kind of hyper loyal and interested small audience that's going to be your core base, as opposed to like trying to get everyone out there.
So what is, like, for lack of a better word, what is it like to go legit, like to work for a network or a radio station or something? What does that entail?
That's interesting.
Wait, as opposed to what's illegitimate?
As opposed to doing it on your own? Like, obviously, like, distribution changes, you have access to new things. I don't know if that's the answer to that question.
I mean, the simple for me would be having someone who can do booking and do editing. I don't like booking, so I'm glad I don't have to do that. And I actually do like editing a lot. I have a background as a DJ, so I was already familiar with a lot of multi-track software from that world. And working with podcasting audio it came very intuitive to me. But it's really time consuming. And since I have a day job, which is like basically teaching y'all, having someone else be able to do that for me, and I don't have to pay them because they're paid by the network, I'm like, oh, that's awesome. I like that deal. I'm willing to roll with that. Yeah.
How about like pitching? Because that's what you did, right? You cold pitched NPR. How was that process back then, and what has it evolved into?
I don't think pitching has changed that dramatically. In the end, what editors or what outlets are looking for is they're looking for reliability, which is to say that if you pitch an idea and they're willing to take a chance on it, and you come up with a series of deadlines as to when those things come in, you honor your deadlines, and then you turn in something that doesn't require a ton of work on the back end. In journalism, what we would say is you meet your deadlines and you turn in clean copy. Clean copy means that it doesn't require a ton of editing on the back end. I think podcasting would work very similarly, which is that if you're asking to deliver something, you deliver it on time and as close to a finished stage as you're capable of, and they have the resources, and if you're working with a larger network, to basically get it in post-production across the finish line. But if you're not reliable, then there's a lot of other people who want to pitch other things to them as well.
I think to answer the go legit question, can we still do that, or is it too late? Okay. What does it feel like? It allows you a lot more resources to create what you want to create. For example, you may have an engineer or a producer or fill-in support. You may have an editor that you wouldn't have to pay for on your own time, graphic designer to do your graphics, social media team, etc. It also means that you have to learn to collaborate because it is part of your job. So, for example, I pitched a show called Tell Them I Am, which is coming out May 6th to KPCC. And it was my baby. I want it to turn out a very specific way. I have a vision for the show. But I don't have the same luxury of bringing that vision to life that I had with Beginner, for example. Because with less oversight, there are less resources. With more resources, there is often more oversight. I think the other part of having your show be a part of a network or being full-time at a place is that you no longer own all or most of your intellectual property. So that is a very, very important thing to think about as you decide how you want to go legit. Because there are people out there who go legit without becoming in-house at a particular network or company or radio station. And that may be more beneficial if you have hopes of turning your IP, as podcasting is becoming bigger and bigger, into a movie or a book or a TV show or a live show, because then there's more return on your investment in that project long term.
Yeah, always read the contract before you sign anything.
Really true. Yeah, and I just I'll keep it short, but and the main thing too is that whenever you're making a podcast, just always, like, the two things you should always be asking yourself is, like, what goal are you trying to achieve from this? I think this is something that Misha always iterates too in the office. It's like, what goal are you trying to reach? Is it you want to reach an audience? Is it for like a creative outlet, or is it because you want to make money? Like, just be real about it. And then two, it's like you got to figure out like who you're going to be speaking to, which is something that Oliver pointed out. Like, you have to know who you're making it for. Otherwise, you can't dictate how you're going to be writing your scripts, how you're going to be editing, and what kind of music you're going to be using. Like, you can't figure those things out if you don't know who you're going to be speaking to. And on top it off, like, with the whole thing of going legit, like that, it all ties in, because if you know what your goals are and if you know the audience, you could maybe do it on your own, and there's a lot of benefit in doing it on your own. One of the podcasts that I made, we were reached out by MTV to make it into a television show, by another book publishing company to make it into a book. We did zero effort into reaching out, but because it's our own, we do not have to go to our lawyers and go like, how do we negotiate these deals? Like, this is all coming, like, we get 100% of the profit. Whereas another time pitching a shows, like, and both of them have pointed out, if you don't read the contracts, like, companies now, like Spotify, they want to own everything. You get a flat rate, you do all the work, and they own everything. Like, the contracts are horrible now, because podcasting, like, every show is being turned into a television show or a movie or something big. So these big companies, they're really trying to make a profit, and you got to protect your ideas.
Yeah, I think when you're not legit, there's a very strong desire to go legit at all costs. Just think twice before you do it.
Yeah.
And then, go for it.
Is there a way to monetize on your own? I mean, obviously, not right off the bat, but somewhere down the road.
Cool. That was also kind of my question. So.
Great. Yeah, I'll start, and then, I mean, I think you can always get advertisers on your own. I did it with Beginner. I made money off the show, enough to live off of it. I was living like a starving person, but it worked. You want to focus on building a following before you try to monetize. And I think, to Oliver's point, you can build a following by focusing on an audience. For Tell Them I Am, it's a show focused on Muslims. And we decided to release it during Ramadan because that's the best time to build a following and a community around a show about Muslims. I am literally going to go to mosques and I'm going to tell people about the show and flyer them about the podcast when it comes out during Ramadan. And there are a lot of other grassroots efforts like that you can do that are specific to your audience to promote your show. There's also a lot of media and journalists who write about very specific topics. So find out their emails, email them. Once you build a following, generally the advertisers come to you, but you can also cold email different advertisers and advertising companies, and they'll help you. Or you can do live shows and ticket live shows and make money off of that. So sell merch, there's a lot of ways to monetize, but build a following first. Try to get to 10,000 before you start thinking about money.
Yeah, and if you...
I'm sorry, real quick. Is that 10,000 downloads a month or per episode? You say 10,000
Per episode.
per episode. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's like if you don't have an audience, you can look for grants. Like if you're doing something that you're reaching to a specific community, you can research grants. And there's so many grants out there that are funding art projects and that ties into being very specific with your idea and the audience that you're trying to reach. And to like what Misha said, like you can go the advertisement route, but you really need an audience first. And the breakdown of it is, I think the average is for every 1,000 downloads for an advertiser, you get $20, around there, 25. So it's actually very challenging to get 1,000 downloads now because there's about 400 podcasts being released every single day. You're competing with a lot of content. And now there's a lot of huge competitors out there, whereas ESPN wasn't a part of it, or ABC wasn't a part of it. Hulu, Netflix, they weren't a part of the industry. Now they are. So you're competing with those people to try to get those listeners. And ultimately, like, the other way of doing it is that, gosh, what was I going to say? For me, at least, what I did is that you go to an advertiser and you just tell them that you want a flat rate. They'll give you a few $1,000s, and you're like, you get to be the exclusive sponsor. And that's kind of one way to avoid the whole download issue. They'll just give you the money, and they're like, great, now we're just be the exclusive sponsor on this podcast. Lastly, the one that I was actually going to bring up is Patreon. And it's all about audience, but Patreon's crowdfunded, and you get like a regular, I think it's monthly that they pay you, or whatever the rate you set. But that I know is very popular.
All right. So by complete actual accident, like I wasn't responsible for this. This is an Asian American panel. I was wondering if you had anything to say about like the state of diversity that you see.
Yeah, I'll start. I don't think there's enough. I don't. I look in one of the reasons I got into podcasting, and one of the reasons why I got interested in this space is because I thought that in public radio, there's an allotted airtime. There's only so many shows you can put on the air. A lot of those shows are already syndicated, they're national, they're all NPR distributed. So a new voice to be heard on the radio, unless you're a reporter, that's pretty much all you're gonna get. With podcasting, what became so exciting is that the field is open. You're not dictated by a clock. You can release content and you can hear all these different voices. That's exciting. But what I'm seeing from this industry with all these big companies is that they're releasing the same kind of shit that public radio is doing. It's the same type of people hosting the shows and the same kind of fucking shows too. It's very infuriating, and you would think that like with podcasting booming at this moment, that these bigger organizations would put more money and put more trust into people who aren't the typical norm of hosting a show. And I don't think that's the case yet. So that's kind of my take on it.
I also think the goal for people of color and different kinds of minorities is, in my opinion, to make mainstream shows rather than just to make shows about our identity. I'm not saying that those shows aren't important and necessary, but I was actually talking to my sister about this the other day, that there seems to be a self-imposed transition period in television, film, podcasting, and other forms of media where most people of color are making content about being a person of color. And I think it would be cool if we made more stuff that was just stuff and we happen to be people of color, because I think that's the way to really increase diversity in the field, and in this industry specifically. So for example, why can't How I Built This be hosted by a woman of color, right? Why can't Invisibilia be hosted? Is it by a woman of color? It isn't, right?
I don't know.
I don't think it is. I mean, honestly, I don't think any major podcast is hosted by a minority. And I think that would be the point at which the industry is truly diverse.
I would just add, I think however ill-defined it is, we think about mainstream podcasting, it's not diverse at all. I don't know I forget what the statistics are, but I want to say it's somewhere at least 80% primarily white. But there's a whole world of podcasting that exists out there that is primarily produced for and by and about people of color that's just simply outside of the mainstream eye. I've heard it described by others as a sort of a Chitlin circuit for podcasting, which you might think of sort of maybe the podcasting equivalent of Black Twitter. In other words, these are networks that are thriving, but they just don't exist within mainstream mass media's awareness of it. And I think that maybe, and this is to your point, Misha, is that at some point, there's no reason why these two things can't be bridged. But if you look at, to the extent that many podcasts are produced out of public radio, and you look at who works in public radio, it's very, very white. And so it's not necessarily surprising, therefore, that a lot of podcasts that emerge out of that world have similar problems in terms of their diversity and inclusion. You know, I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish, but I do think to the extent that to create a podcast, and I think this is reflective of what we've been saying here, there's not the same kind of layers of gatekeeping that might have existed in other media outlets in the past. It doesn't require a ton to get started with it. And I think to that extent, in the same way that we see things like YouTube is a far more diverse platform than, let's say, you know, cable television, I think maybe we're on the verge in which a generation of people who have the tools of self-production and self-distribution will begin to shift this, but it's not going to happen magically, and it's certainly not going to happen overnight.
What podcasts do you guys listen to? Or if you listen to them, because I know some people just don't have the time.
James.
Oh, man. Well, I've been in production with a couple podcasts, or several podcasts currently, and so my rule is, I'm not going to, maybe I'll tell. This is so bad. I don't like this band, but I like their philosophy. I think they're one of the worst bands in the world. But it's the band Creed. I don't know if you guys know Creed. And I remember when they had their debut album and it went like it went big. And they're like, what was your process in making the second album? Like, we didn't listen to anything. We were just kind of trying to influence ourselves and trying to tap into our own creativity. And like, obviously their music doesn't speak for that. But I do think that I do think that idea is true, because like, for me, whenever I'm making something, I don't want to be inspired by what is happening now. I want to take a step back and really look at a project and see how we can approach it without being influenced by the trends of what's happening now. So I haven't actually been listening to any podcast because of it, because I'm just in that mode. But when I do get bored, I listen. One of them I always listen to is Reply All, because they're just amazing. And then there's another show called Tiger Belly. It's hosted by Bobby Lee, and I just think Bobby Lee is one of the most funniest guys out there. So I listen to a lot of talk podcasts. Reply All is not that talk, but I listen to a lot of talk podcasts when I'm in production mode.
Want me to go? Okay. The one that I've most consistently listened to for the longest time is How I Built This, because I want to be rich and famous, and that podcast has people who have succeeded, and I'm obsessed with the process of getting there. So I also personally like Guy Raz. It took some getting used to, but now I like him. Yeah, I mean, I've listened to the others that are big. That's the only one that I like keep going back to over time.
Partly because I have to commute back and forth between where I live and here. I actually listen to a lot of podcasts. And so my favorites would include, I mean, really to me, I would consider one of the granddaddy of them all, which is Dan Savage's Savage Love, which is a sex and relationship podcast that this week, I just looked this up real quick, he's up to episode 650. So he's been doing this, I mean, as long as anyone else that I can remember. And Dan was way, way ahead of the curve. And for an advice podcast, I still think he puts out actually a pretty good product, which is not always the case with advice podcasts. I won't name the ones I listen to and kind of hate listening to because I find them frustrating. It might be on Slate. Anyways, I really like the Rewatchables, which is on the Ringer Network. It's one of Bill Simmons's like 18 podcasts that he does. And their concept is actually very similar to ours on Heat Rocks, except instead of albums, they're talking about movies. And I don't know what it is, but I just like listening to people talk about movies they like, and it's not like the best. How should I put it? It's another like several people in a room talking podcast, which I feel like is a format that can go wrong very easily when it's not edited well, or you don't really have people who are particularly good on mic. But the Rewatchables, I think, actually does a pretty good job with it. But my absolute favorite podcast host who does two podcasts is Phoebe Judge, who is a podcaster out of North Carolina. Her main one is called Criminal. It's a weekly show that is focused around true crime, but in a very loose interpretation of what true crime is. And then she has another one which is more limited because it only runs in seasons, which is called This Is Love. And similar to Criminal, the idea of love is interpreted in a very broad way. But number one, I think her and her team do a really lovely job with every single podcast they do. You can tell it's produced really well. And she just has a phenomenal voice, and as someone who fell in love with radio partly because I like listening to people talk on the radio, including myself, I just like really listening to Phoebe talk, and I just think that what she does with both those shows is fantastic.
So even when you aren't listening like recreationally, like what do you listen for if you're listening critically to a podcast? Like what are markers of quality or like production?
I think the two for me, I already mentioned this earlier, is what is the audio quality? Right? Does this sound like someone gave a shit in terms of how this should sound? So that's number one. And then on the back end does it seem like it was edited at all? In other words, and it really has more to do with, did they think about how to produce something that is very listenable and does not have a lot of extraneous stuff to it? We usually tape around an hour's worth of audio, but our final shows are more like 40 to 45 minutes. And one of the things that our editor has gotten really good at is identifying what parts really don't need to be there, even though in the middle of a conversation it may seem meaningful, but upon listening to it on the back end, it's like, this is the stuff that really should be there, and there's other stuff that's kind of like, that's the stuff that should go.
Yeah, for me, when I'm actually like listening critically and stuff for inspiration, one show that I think just kills it, and one quality that I look for is story structure. I always want to see where they start, what are the beats that they're trying to hit, where's the story turning to, and then in the end, what is the big point that they're trying to make. One show that I think does it so freaking well is Heavyweight, hosted by Jonathan Goldstein. And that show, it's a combination of his voicing, his writing is just amazing, his producing stuff is incredible, but ultimately it's just a very simple thing. His show concept is literally one person had a falling out with someone else, and he has a reunion, and then they try to hash out their problems. Like, that's all the concept is, but it is the most amazing stuff that I've heard. Like, it's probably my favorite show out there. And then two, I'm always looking for innovation. Like, I just wanted to find how people are doing things in a new way, in a daring way. The last time, I'm trying to think, this is probably not the last time, but the moment that stuck out to me is a show called The Habitat. And this was about, it's true, where it's like NASA did an experiment, 6 people, they put them on Hawaii because the landscape mimics Mars, and they basically could not leave this dome for, I want to say, 6 months to a year. So it's pretty much like Real World, but the podcast. But the way in which they did it, people said that it was boring. I thought it was the most fascinating thing. They did something where it was just like, someone made an offhand comment of like, gosh, I wish my life could be narrated by Morgan Freeman. And then boom, the next scene is like, hi, I'm Morgan Freeman, and then just narrating like 5 minutes of the episode, not even explaining anything, but they just go down this path, and you're just like, holy crap, like they're really going for it. It's just, I'm just always looking for the new.
I have nothing more to add.
Well, speaking of innovation, both on a storytelling level and like a technology level, like where do you see podcasting going in the next few years?
I think fiction's where it's at.
Sorry, say again?
Fiction. I think fiction is the medium in which everyone is making horror, sci-fi, murder mysteries, and there is a untapped genre of where is the girls of fiction? Where is, Master of None or all these other shows, or Insecure? Like, that does not exist in fiction. And you have currently Hollywood talking about diversity and how there's a lack of resources and a lack of whatever it may be to make these stories. And here you have podcasting where it's easier access. The money is, it's easier to make. You can make a show that's on the scale of Insecure and the show on the scale of Game of Thrones for the same budget. And yet no one is utilizing this medium to tell these kinds of stories. So,
which I would just add is ironic, given that radio for decades, had radio serialized drama. So in a lot of ways, it's just kind of going back full circle to what radio was doing probably, 50, 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I think specialization of roles. So as the industry grows bigger, there will be fewer and fewer producers who are doing everything and more writers, engineers, sound designers, editors. I don't know. I can't even think of other roles. One can hope. I think it will happen. I think it's definitely happening.
We'll see.
That's my 2 cents.
Or even on a business level with the Spotify buyout, and I've seen a lot of union stuff happening places.
I think that stuff we have to see play out. Let's see what happens when Luminary comes out in the next 2 weeks. And, I don't know. I mean, we can comment on it, but some things I think we might want to just wait 6 months before we say something about it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it for my questions. Does anyone have any in the crowd? I'm gonna
I have one for Misha specifically. You said you wanted to be a lawyer at first.
Yeah.
Yeah, how do you tell people, because I'm kind of looking at that route too, and I tell people I want to be like a radio host or a podcast host, and I'm always met with criticism because I say I want to do that. So how do you tell people that you went one route and not the other?
I just say ignore them and do what you want and get really good at it, and then think about what they're doing in their tiny little office somewhere and feel good about it, because that's what I do.
So spiteful.
This is specifically about fiction podcasts. What is it like in the development stages? How do you go about writing a fiction podcast? Do you find writers and just the basics of development?
Yeah. With fiction, there is a writer's room. The last one that I worked on that was released, it was about 3 or 4 people writing various episodes. They storyboarded it and outlined everything first, and then each person got assigned 2 episodes to write. So it was around 4 writers. After that, that's when they shipped around the script. This show is Deadly Manners I'm talking about. So they shipped around the script, and they had a budget. And it's the same network that produces, I think, RuPaul's podcast. But they reached out, and they got actors like LeVar Burton, Kristen Bell, RuPaul, people from Veep, someone from 13 Reasons Why. So they really went hard on getting these actors. And the way in which they got it was that they first got Kristen Bell, and then everyone else started to agree because that one big name was there. And then when I came in, they recorded all the lines separately. There's about 10 main characters in this fiction show, and they recorded them on 3 different microphones. And so my job was to then take all of this tape and then edit it down and follow the script and edit. Each person use the right microphone for their voice or whatever effect that they're going for, put in the sound design, the music, and then we hand it off to the sound designer, and then we, once that's done, we mix the episode. That entire process, I don't know how long the writing took, but in terms of the production process of recording the voicing, which we did in about a day, and then to editing everything, it took for each episode maybe about a month to do that process. Fiction is hard. It is the hardest genre to do. There's a reason why not a lot of people step into it, because it takes a lot of money, a lot of time, and it's already difficult to do a documentary and explain to people what's happening visually. With fiction, that's all that is, and you're trying to make the dialogue natural. It's just hard from the top down. So, yeah, that's pretty much the process. And I say don't jump into fiction unless you have a budget and you really have a large crew to help you out.
Hey, so this is kind of an oof of a question, but it's just come from my own experience doing a podcast fairly regularly for a couple years. How do you deal with burnout? Or have you ever had to deal with burnout?
I mean, this is something, especially because both me and my co-host have to do a weekly show, and both of us have day jobs, because this is not, I mean, I'm very thankful for the money that we get for it, but it's not really paying our bills. And trying to produce 52 new shows a year is taxing. And so one of the things that we have tried to implement, and this is still a work in progress, is to figure out a number of new episodes that we can live with, but also build in time to take off. And so what we've settled on is we're trying to produce 44 shows a year, and then at 2 different points. So we're going to have a month off in May, where we're not going to come in and tape, and then another, hopefully in the fall, maybe in October, to take another month off. And then even just having those weeks off kind of allows us to recharge and then come back and, go through the slog for another 6 months at a time. But it helps just to not have to necessarily be on tap every single week. But no, that part's real. I mean, part of the reason why I did college radio for 10 years, which I loved, except at the end of it, where I was coming in and doing a 3-hour music show every week. As much as I loved doing radio, it just felt like work, and it wasn't work I was being paid for. And I just decided, like, I'm out. Like, I just don't want to do this anymore. And I'm very wary of that same thing happening with this show, because as much as I love doing it, I also know that it's very easy for something to go from a passion to feeling like a slog. And so I think just being mindful of, if we need breaks, then let's figure out a way to engineer that. Yeah.
Misha, do you have a...
Do I have an answer to this question? No, because I'm on the verge of burning out. So check back in with me in 6 months, and I'll let you know.
I'll speak from both public radio and podcasting. When I was working on a few public radio shows, burnout is real, and they don't care. Like that, both jobs in public radio and podcasting for full time, it is hard because it's incredibly competitive to get one of these jobs. I mean, it took me to leave the industry, go to Texas, and then finally find a job. That was like a 2-year process to just land something that was an assistant producer position after doing it for so long. Like it's tough. And I worked on daily shows, I worked on weekly shows. And there are moments where, and Misha's heard this, but I stayed till the office till 6 in the morning, and then I have to come back in at 9 o'clock in the morning. Like it's real, and they don't care. And the only thing to protect it is that there's a 2-week vacation. That's at least how the jobs that I've had run. And then in terms of podcasting, like majority of it, at least with KPCC, we have not really had a break. We've been jumping from project to project to project, and we just haven't had time to rest. I think Misha ultimately will get to when Tell Them I Am is out, and with me, I think I have another 6 months left before I can see something like that. And the way I look at it is that I got into this industry knowing what I wanted to do. I said in 5 years, I want to be here. And so I knew I was going to burn myself out. And really, I am just living with that decision, and I think this is when people start to leave and they choose a different career path, because it's really taxing. And so, I'm doing podcasts on the side on top of having a full-time job. It's essentially what Oliver is doing and what Misha is doing too. And, the way I guess massage this idea is that I tell myself I'm young and I'm only going to get older and I won't be able to work this hard 10 years down the line, so I'm just going to go really hard now because it's only going to get harder and more competitive, this industry. I know, that's not the best answer, but it's, it sucks. Yeah.
I mean, get massages often, speaking of massage.
Find a network that has an in-house massage.
There you go.
Okay, so I know that like KPCC and NPR have like set times for each of their shows and whatnot, but what's like the optimum time frame or length that a independent podcast should be? Like, what's the sweet spot for an independent sort of production?
There are like studies on this. There's Edison's Share of the Year. There's there's one more that I'm forgetting. The Infinite Dial.
Yeah, Infinite Dials.
I would just Google those and read those. They have all those numbers. But I also think like you can just test it in front of your future audience and see what they like to hear, So let's say you're making a show for 15 James Kimses, and you just like get James and all of his friends into a room and you ask them what they think, and watch them. Like, are they getting bored? Are they yawning? Are they like getting up to go to the bathroom a lot? What are they doing in the bathroom? But like, take all of that to try to figure out what the length is, and don't pay too much attention to those numbers that are out there.
Right. I think this point, and this goes back to know your audience, because it really varies. There's a fairly popular podcast out there called The Gilmore Guys, where every episode they talk about an episode of Gilmore Girls, and their episodes regularly run 2 to 3 hours. And when I first saw that runtime, I just thought I thought my eyes had gone wrong, because who wants to listen to a 2 to 3 hour podcast about the Gilmore Girls? And so I gave it a listen. I'm like, okay, I kind of get this, but this is absolutely not for me. But they clearly have an audience. So someone out there, I mean, they have a substantial audience they're super happy to listen to people talk about their show for like 120 plus minutes, which to me is like, I can't do that. But again, each audience is different.
Yeah, and I know that NPR did a study, and they said the sweet spot is between 20 to 25 minutes. And I'm going to reiterate what everyone said. Like, really, you should just be. I never use that as a rule. I don't care about time. I really don't. It's all about the story and what interests me. And so whenever I'm making something, I just am always like, is this something that I'm entertained by when I'm listening back to? And I'm using myself as a judge in terms of what exactly I'm making and how much I'm entertained by it. Because it all depends on exactly what you're making. Like the other podcast I listen to The Read. That it's almost 2 hours long. And I listen to the entire show. And at the same time, there's episodes of 99% Invisible that they're 20 minutes long, and I can't make it past the 5 minutes because I'm bored. Like, it really depends on what you're trying to make, and ultimately, you just got to make it for yourself first. So just don't care about time, really.
It's clear you're not doing it just for the money. So you're doing it for something you love. What's a moment that you've had in your podcast career that you think is a highlight?
I'm definitely doing it for the money. I mean, yes, I love it, but
Good
also
luck with
like
that.
I better make a fuck ton of money, but by the time this is over.
I believe him.
I mean, I work with him. He can verify that.
Yeah, I believe in Misha, though. I think she's going to make a lot of money.
To answer your question, what's a highlight? Honestly, surprisingly, not the ones where like I got written up in like some article. Yeah, I thought it was going to be when we got the New Yorker review for the big one, but it was not. I think, I don't know. It's usually just been like those little days in the office where like we all just go get a beer at lunch after we've been like staring at a screen for like 7 hours and can't figure out what to do next, for where to put music or whatever. I can't think of like one specific moment. I think there are many, but you guys go ahead.
Yeah, for me, I guess it's when I was in Marfa, Texas, and I did that internship, and I told myself I'm going to make this show, this podcast, because up until then, the only things I've really done were like 4-minute, 5-minute pieces. I never made something more than 10 minutes long, and the stuff that I was making was 20 minutes long. It was the first time that I was project managing. I was telling people what to do. It was a team of 3 others. I basically told all the interns that you're working on my show now. But it was amazing because everyone wanted to, and everyone got to host their own episode. But I got to oversee all that process. And it was a moment of, it was testing because I've never had experience before, and then to be thrusted onto that type of position, I just didn't know if I was able to pull it off. And for me, I felt like, at least in the moment, I haven't listened to that show since whenever it was made, but for me, it was after everything was done, it was like, holy crap, we actually made something. Like, that was kind of a really great moment.
There's some episodes that are more of my favorites for whatever reason. The one that stands out in terms of the episode that I'm proudest of was I interviewed Vernon Reid, who's the guitarist of Living Colour. I mean, he's one of the greatest guitarists alive. And he wanted to talk about Jimi Hendrix's Band of Gypsies. And not only was Vernon incredibly smart, I felt like I was getting a master class in just guitar technique. But we were between producers, so I edited the show, and I did all the sound editing and music editing for it. And again, not to like pat myself in the back, I thought I did a really good job with it. Like, I'm really proud of how that episode sounds. But in terms of my favorite moments, the thing is, and this goes back to the burnout question, is that a lot of the times, like prepping for the show and dealing with kind of the ancillary stuff, like keeping up with the social media stuff, because that's all on us to do, that can feel like a slog. But once a week, I get to step into a studio and I get to talk to people about music, about what they love about it. And it's like, with the exception of like maybe a very, very small handful of episodes where I kind of left the taping thinking like, that was kind of mediocre. For the most part, it's delightful. Like, I love talking about music with people when they're passionate about it. And so in that sense, my favorite moment is like, there's always going to be multiple moments in every single taping where it's like, you've now made me rethink what I thought about this album or about this artist, or you're sharing a personal anecdote about your relationship to music, and I never can get enough of those things. So, yeah.
Wait, can I do my answer over again? Okay, so I figured out a specific moment that happened very recently, and I was inspired by Oliver's answer. So, Tell Them I Am, I started making because I have not seen any mainstream portrayals of Muslims that are not about them being Muslim, like in some way, shape, or form. And so I was like, I'm gonna make a show where every episode is a person who is Muslim talking about not talking about being Muslim, just anything but. And honestly, like, it was just this idea I had no idea it was gonna work. And we start working on the show. It's like kind of a slog. Right after the big one, I felt like just going home and taking a really long nap. And I think one of our like first 4 people that we interview is this woman, Dina Hagag. And she's not the most famous person we interview. She is the CEO of a organization called United States Artists, where they give like $50,000 grants to artists, no strings attached. And we weren't even in the same room. Like, this was a phone interview where somebody was recording her on her end because we don't have the budget to fly to her. And it was one of those moments where like I fell in love with her by the end of the interview. I was like literally and completely in love with her, and so was my producer, and so was our engineer. And we walked out of it and I was like, oh my God, that's the point of the show. And yes, it's totally gonna work because I'm in love with her and everyone in this room is in love with her. And so the people who are gonna listen to this will be too, you know? So I think it's moments like those, usually when you're interacting with a human being, that make it all worth it.
Hi again. So you guys have all worked on multiple projects, that's correct? So how do you know which one is the one, and how do you determine the value of each one of your projects?
What do you mean by the one?
Like the one that would gain the most traction, attention, notoriety?
I think you just know. It's like when you meet the person you love, you just know. But I also think you should treat every single one like it's the one, and every single one like it doesn't matter at all. Because if you're too married to it, and if you think it's too big of a deal, it's not going to be the best possible product. You know, like, I mean, I said this a little bit earlier, but like specifically with the big one too, I really, really was attached to it at the beginning, and by the end I kind of didn't give a fuck. And it's not like, that's not necessarily a negative thing. It just got to a point where the collaborative process and the product that we were coming to at the end of that collaborative process for every single episode was so effective that I was like, it's not worth it for me to fight for every single word and to be married to the vision that I initially had of this project, because it will come out really good. I'll sleep well at night if I ever get to sleep. And if it gains traction, great. It's definitely going to do well. You know what I mean? Like, we knew it had the basic elements of a show that was going to do well. With Tell Them I Am, it's like an all-celebrity cast. It's going to do well. But after that, it's like I can't be that attached to every single one of the 22 episodes that we're doing. This morning, James came over to help me with our forward that we're writing, and I was like, James, do whatever you want. Like, at some point, I was like, I just trust you. I can't do this anymore. I can't be that married to every single breath, you know? Long-winded way of saying you'll know.
I would say the one is, it's the one in which you haven't gotten sick of it yet and no one's pulled the plug on you.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. I don't like working on things for a long time. That's why I left public radio and I'm doing podcasting, because you can jump to whatever podcast you want, or, you know, and do seasonal. Public radio doesn't do that. So for me,
James has commitment phobia.
I do. We're not getting into that. And yeah, so for me, it's like, what idea am I not tired of? That's pretty much kind of like, with every idea, you're always stoked about it, but the more you think about it, sometimes your idea is like, fuck, that's dumb. But, you know, the ones that you don't think that, go with it.
So everybody, let's thank our guests for their time.